And we are live. Another CEO Wisdom podcast with Rob Hulme. He is CEO and Group Director at the Boralis Group. We're going to talk about a bunch of interesting topics today: innovation, food waste, agri-food tech, food security, and sustainability, amongst others. This podcast brought to you by potbuyer.com. If you want to start, scale, be invited to a podcast, or even find sponsors for your podcast, you can go to potbuyer.com to do this. Rob, welcome to the pod. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and the Boralis Group?
Hey, Charles, thanks for having me. So I'm an Australian, now living here in Sydney. I grew up on a farm in Australia, so that was one of four brothers. And so our growing up, we were kicking around on the farm, and we cropping and cattle and all of the stuff. We used to get into trouble. I headed off to boarding school, so I spent a full board at boarding school away from the farm, and didn't really know what I wanted to do at the end of school, and so I ended up studying agriculture, so science. And after 5 years, got a job with Bayer. And so I spent a long career with Bayer, and after many years, started my own company, a consultancy, and after traveling around the world, I found myself back home, and we've just more or less landed back in Sydney, and after 17 years away, traveling overseas.
Wow. Okay. I'm on the Boralis Group website. I'm seeing like what you guys do precisely. Can you tell me about the services you offer and to what types of clients and why it's so relevant?
Yeah, sure. So our broad approach is helping enterprise scale sustainable food systems. So there's a lot of talk about regenerative farming systems and processing or circular economy platforms. But often it's hard to actually, apply and scale that technology. So what we do is we work with individual enterprise, and we sort of sit between the investor, the innovator, and industry, and working also with government agencies, but really focus on the enterprise. So what do they need to do to adopt or scale or do the extension of existing good agricultural practice? And what does that look like? It's a combination of saving money, being more efficient. So, for instance, using technology to do the dirty, dangerous, dull and dumb jobs, but also mainstreaming sustainable ag practices. And what does that look like? It's in the case of farming systems, it's minimum or zero tillage. In the case of processing, it's repurposing and upcycling waste assets. And for farming, farming's in my blood. It's what I'm passionate about, and food supply. But I'm sort of tapping into that experience that I've had around, in particular in Asia, and what it means now here in Australia. I mean, we've got about 26 million people in Australia. We produce enough food for, I think, 75 million. So we're a huge exporter of food. And I think, our green and clean credentials, you could challenge that. And so a lot of the process around how do we prove, how do we validate, how do we justify what we're doing on a global stage, so that our export products are sort of adopted and trusted by consumers.
For those that don't know, also Rob took this call at 5:30 a.m. in the morning in Australia, so that's the kind of guy he is. I'm trying to, find your highlights, Rob, because you've got so many on your LinkedIn. Let's start with the Buyers Group. I think Bayer Crop Science. I think that would be a great start. You've got so many highlights here. Maybe if you can start like with in the 90s, right? And that would lead to your
Yeah.
The amazing stuff I'm reading here about China with working with DGI and WeChat groups is like really
Yeah.
innovative. I just love that. So start with in the 90s and scale up
Yeah.
to your actual accomplishments there.
Yeah, sure. So when I left university at that stage in 1990, seems like a long time ago, back when I had more hair. So it's,
Right.
you know, it was tough to get a job. You know, there was a recession on, and, you know, I actually went back to the farm for a while, and was helping out on the farm. And I just chanced across, you know, a job application in a local town, which roughly between Sydney and Melbourne. It was as a technical officer, so doing trial work. And a predecessor company to Bayer was Shearing. It's also a German company. And, you know, it seemed interesting. And so I was basically doing trial work for chemicals, for crop protection chemicals. I was working with farmers doing, you know, field days, you know, spraying trials, writing trial reports, and actually working under some really experienced people. I was very fortunate to have, during my career, also great mentors, great support from people who helped my career. So I started out, that was for 4 years, and then I had an opportunity to go to Melbourne into the head office at that stage. We'd already done one merger, so it had been bought out by Hearst, or merged with Hearst to form Agri-food. And I had a chance to go into marketing, so I thought, why not? You know, so I became a product manager, and you know, it was sort of more or less that was the start of the journey of being sort of characterized as being open and curious, and open to new opportunities, basically. And then there was a process also of more mergers and you know, success in what we were doing, launching products, and the business was growing. And then there was another merger, and I took on a role as commercial manager. So I was managing a sales team. So it's sort of gone from technical or research into marketing, and then over the course of time into commercial, managing a sales team. So that was, you know, managing a P&L for the first time, managing people, and having direct reports. And I was fortunate to go into a development center, what they call a development center in Singapore. So I was nominated for that, went over to Singapore. It was a sort of an intensive 3-day, you know, basically project after project, or task. And they're really testing you just to put the acid on you to see, you know, how you perform under pressure, you know, where your skill sets. And one of the observers of that, I did really well at that. And one of the observers was Raj Kaul. He's Indian descent, lived in Germany, head of the mergers and acquisitions group. And he was my observer, and he basically offered me a job on the spot. I think that was in September, October of that year. By January 2007, I was in Germany, and so I was working with the mergers and acquisitions group, initially doing some divestments, some acquisitions. And he came to my office one day and said, "Look, we've been doing some technology licensing work previously. How about you have a look at all of these folders?" He had a stack about 6 feet high. He said, "Have a look through those and give me an idea of what we should be doing with our other assets." And basically, you know, it evolved over a couple of weeks, and we formed a technology licensing group. We went to the board, convinced the board that we should be basically trading assets that were sitting dormant, so unlocking cash, unlocking, you know, market access with other companies. And that's what I did. And I was sort of like, I hit a purple patch. I was like, you know, I was having fun, we were having success. It was tough, but we were sort of coordinating this little United Nations team of people, from really, really smart people, which is sort of another takeaway, right? my career has been characterized by surrounding myself with people that are much smarter than me. And so somehow, I'm able to get the best out of people and get teams functioning and getting outcomes, and really enjoying that. So, and at the end of that process, we did a large acquisition in the US. And again, I got a call saying, would you like to go to Vietnam? So it was sort of Vietnam's relatively small country, P&L about 20 million revenue, about 600 staff, including factory. And so we found ourselves in Vietnam, and it was like going out of, Germany was great, and but you're still then in Asia, right? So you've got this sort of massive cultural shift with amazing food and amazing people and amazing access to what's great about Asia. And so we found ourselves for 3 years or 2 years, 2.5 years in Vietnam. Wasn't long enough, but had a lot of success. Basically, what happened in the mandate, the directive to scope to go into Vietnam was to restructure. Quite a bit of corruption, issues with inventories, so structuring of sales teams and innovation pipelines. And so we had a lot of success there. We restarted the pipeline. We got recognition globally, and then I got a call from the CEO one day. I'd actually just got out of hospital. I had a stint in hospital where I had to be airlifted out to Thailand for emergency procedure. And I just got out of hospital, and the CEO called and said, "Oh, would you like to go to China?" So it was like, okay, yeah, fair, great, go to China. So we'd sort of just set things up. We were ready to kick back and enjoy all the restructuring. And then, 2 months later, I was in China doing the same thing. So it was 4 years based in Beijing. And, that was tough. 4 years that was very, very intense. It was more or less the same scope, but just on a much bigger, it was 1,200 staff. We had manufacturing facilities, we had production processing facilities, we had staff all over the country. We had these huge issues with inventories and challenges around communicating, how that impacted the business and how we actually traded out of that. And I think we had some success. We had a lot of learnings for me personally coming out of that, but how to manage a business in Asia in particular under that much sort of global spotlight. Lots of potential in China, lots of issues with accessible market versus addressable market, and how you engage with governments. And following that stint for 4 years, I went to Singapore. And so I spent time in Singapore as head of business development and innovation, innovation ambassador for the group. And then that's where I found myself spinning out of Bayer after 26 years, sort of interested in the dark side of corporate life, and
Right.
what it meant to go into a startup, basically.
Okay, so couple questions here. Just for context for folks, Bayer has a market cap of $52 billion. For those that didn't know, 44 billion revenue on a yearly basis, 100K employees, was founded in 1862, I believe, something like that, in Germany. So very old company. How do you build a behemoth like that? Is it a product of time and just like massive momentum? Could I reproduce that on my side, but in 10 years? With AI?
I think it's Bayer was an amazing company to work with. In terms of the resources and the support that you could get, but actually even more so, it was the people and I still keep in touch with a number of ex-colleagues. We actually just had a catch up in Melbourne a couple of months ago. And I don't know, there might have been 40 people, 40 or 50 people maybe, but we counted up, there was over 1,000 years of experience in the room, industry experience in agriculture sitting in the room. It was amazing. And so people build companies, people build products to build companies, and you can have the best product. And we actually demonstrated that in China. We turned it around. We had a pipeline, I think, of 18 launches over 4 years, and with a pipeline of launches through to 2020, I think it was. But actually being able to execute that totally relied, and the failures that we had, some of the failures that we had directly related to lack of execution, and the ability to execute. So capability and capacity, we spent a lot of time building up team capability and capacity and training in order to actually execute on. So you asked me, can you build a company like that today? It's tough. These days, the success of Bayer, the share price is a third of what it was when Mariah Deckers left. Very successful head of Bayer.
The Roundup stuff kind of hurt the stock price quite a lot too. That was like $1 billion suit or something like that.
Oh no, more. It's still ongoing. And look, I'd be lying if that when Bayer purchased Monsanto, that was around the time that I left. And I guess part of the decision was, I'd sort of done 4 mergers. I've been part of 4 mergers over 26 years. And I think I'd had 12 different positions in 5 different departments over 5 countries or something. And it was just time to do something different. It wasn't really because I didn't like working for Bayer. It was like you'd just been curious about what else is there. But I'd be lying if I'd said that and what the team are going through still in that integration of culture, not forget portfolio, the Monsanto portfolio and GM crops, and the Roundup, the glyphosate portfolio was huge and still is huge.
Mergers is like lung transplant, or I'm not even sure if that's possible. It's like a transplant. You try to put an organ in the body and the body is like trying to reject it. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, to some extent, I guess. Merging companies and cultures is tough at the best of times when you have a European or a German culture and an American culture. Bringing those two in together, and it's not even where the merger happens on the ground level in the country. That's like those cultures. There is a corporate culture that is an overlay that can cause differences in approach to the market. But you're talking about Americans or Australians who are working for companies, not, it's not Germans, and Americans type thing across the world. So in Australia, there would be Aussies working for Monsanto and Aussies working for Bayer, right? So that's not necessarily where the cultural clash comes. It's more at the corporate and head office level and how you actually manage strategy and your approach to market and how Bayer's
different SOPs, I guess. Like which SOPs do we follow in that case?
Yeah, look, Bayer's a very conservative company, and Monsanto traditionally, as an American company, is quite an aggressive. When I say aggressive, market-facing, go-getter company. And I think to some extent, some of the challenges that Bayer continue to have is because of that. Some of the issues around culture, but it's also a sense, where the market's at with large crop protection companies. And back when I was in Germany, we were also already looking at biologicals portfolios and trying to expand and diversify our portfolio away from synthetic chemistry, or at least, and that was sort of manifested also in digital farming. So I was leading the digital farming group in Asia out of Singapore. And digital farming at that stage was, insights for helping farmers with decision support, or, trying to find ways to have a position. The problem was, of course, making money out of the digital farming portfolio versus the chemistry, which is, it's a good money earner, right? So
Right.
finding ways to actually make money out of it can be tough.
I want to close a micro chapter here. Two questions. How much can an exec in your position make a year? Is it fair to say that it's around 300, 500K? That's one. And two, how did you deal with the personal aspect of constantly traveling? Right. So let's keep it to those two for now, the personal aspect.
Yeah, I was on the way Bayer worked, you're off a local contract, like a global contract. So my base was here in Australia. So even though I went to Germany and to Vietnam and to China and to Singapore, my contract base was here in Australia. So it was an expat contract. Typically, those contracts have sort of been phased out now, and you go onto a local, what they call as a local contract. And so traditionally, with the expat contracts, well, you would be a decent salary base. It wasn't the best paying in the market, but it certainly wasn't the worst. It was probably, as a CEO, it'd be a couple $100,000. But then you get, if you had young kids, then you get schooling and you get housing allowance and you would get car and you would get, return leave allowance. And so you start to add those things up, and it's a pretty good package. But aside from the cash component, there's also the training component and the access to market. If you have a Bayer logo on your shirt, it gets you tickets to open. It opens doors, right? So acknowledging that that part of the training, the exposure, being able to go to, I was fortunate to be able to go to a leadership course in Harvard. I was getting executive coaching with Korn Ferry. We were doing marketing programs at IMD in Switzerland. Bayer invested really heavily in staff and support for staff, and I guess that part of that offset the cash component, but it also meant that you were looked after, and still looked after. They're a great company. But coming back to your original question about, can you build a company like that today? There's a lot of it's a little bit like today in Australia. From 10 years ago, land was roughly $2,000 an acre. So if you wanted to buy land and go in and start farming, it was it's expensive, but it was okay. Today, it's about $12,000 an acre. And
how can we innovate? Do we even need to buy land? Can't I just build a platform in the air or in the sea?
Well, no.
In space.
No. I've got a particular view on that. I think aside from the cost, the capital cost and the return on capital for land and land assets, there's lots of talk about going to Mars, right? My view is, and I understand that can be a seed or catalyst for innovation and technology, and space travel's been part of that, since going to the moon, I guess. But my thing is, we talk about a moonshot approach to, going to Mars or Mars. We should be focused on what we've got now, and so, but building, growing rice on barges and stuff like that. I mean, there's so much we can do with the existing assets that we have, rather than just raping and pillaging that and trying to go off to another planet. I mean, it just doesn't sit right with me. We're spending a lot of money on that when we could be spending and redirecting those resources into mainstreaming sustainable production platforms here with what we've got.
Because there's still very cheap land out there. Now the question is, is it fertile? I guess we can find a bunch of fertile land for cheap. And now the logistics, right? Can it be drone enabled? But drones aren't legally allowed to travel. Then we're seeing companies that are into hyper shipping, kind of Hyperloop style. I forgot that project of Elon, but ships so fast and it's pressurized, so we could ship stuff very, very quickly across the border, basically. where's the innovation? Where's your mind nowadays on how we could farm and have agriculture abundantly and at scale everywhere in the world?
Yeah, look, they're probably the two biggest milestone, production milestone events in the last 10 years have been vertical farming, so controlled environment agriculture, but vertical farming specifically in that category of CEA, as opposed to hybrid greenhouses, but vertical farming that's totally sealed, requires 100% on energy input for lighting and climate control. And Silicon Valley's turned their attention to investing into vertical farming systems globally. And we work with, we consulted to a number of companies in Singapore, in Asia in particular, to support the growth, market entry and growth of those companies. And that was also on the seed genetics side, as well as on the production side. But it became clear that the challenges for vertical farming, it's probably three key challenges. One's around genetics and having fit for purpose genetics so that the crops are designed to grow in that space. The second is around energy, and it's probably actually the biggest challenge they still have, aside from the capital cost. And the third is around go-to-market and being disruptive. And so if you think about hyperlocal food production systems in cities where people live, there is a value, there is an investment thesis for us that if we can produce it close to where people live, there are less food miles to actually transport that food to where it's actually consumed. And that investment thesis still holds for hybrid greenhouse production systems. We helped build or expand a rooftop hybrid greenhouse in Singapore with a company called Comcrop, and Peter Barber is the CEO for Comcrop. Amazing guy, amazing story. With Blackmagic, has his totally separate market with post-production video editing stuff, but this baby of his, in terms of hyperlocal food production in Singapore, he's gone from 20 tons to 200-300 tons production in this rooftop greenhouse, and yet convincing local businesses, local retail supermarkets and government agencies to buy local first and make that aware to consumers is a hard road. So that's why part of the reason why you're seeing vertical farms going into administration, consolidating. There's a process of consolidation at the moment. I think not all. Some are still actually doing a good job in terms of balancing, how they position the crops that they're growing. But as a panacea for replacing mainstream conventional agriculture, it's not really moving the needle. And that's not to say that in the future there may not be some innovation in energy and genetics that will help offset that. And there is some progress in that area. But so that's the first one. And the second one, which you would have obviously read around, is precision fermentation and cellular agriculture, or fake meat. And in the same way, it's also facing similar challenges. It's hard to scale. It's technically feasible, but it's hard to scale. It's expensive. And as a replacement, which is the way it was positioned to investors, as a replacement for conventional production of animals, it's not, I don't believe it'll move the needle. There'll be a specific use case for it. There's some really interesting applications, to replace whale meat, or, there's a company, Vow here in Australia, that's doing some really interesting stuff in that space. But is it going to move the needle for domestic, replacement of domesticated or, livestock in industries? It's hard to see that right now. Plant-based proteins are slightly different. Plant-based proteins like Beyond and Impossible. Again, I think they're under pressure. I think they've missed the mark, or at least positioned to investors that it's a panacea replacement. You still need to grow those crops, right? And you need to process it and transport that. And so there are costs associated with that. And some of the products are just not coming up to what's still the two key criteria for success in that segment is taste and price. Forget sustainability. I mean, it's important, but it's not the driver for mainstream purchase behavior. It's taste and price. And if you're not going to meet the mark on those two things, then I really honestly believe you don't have a product. Now, having said that, there are some great products, and we've also invested in a company called Fable. They have a shiitake mushroom replacement. So it's not being positioned as a replacement for meat. It's more as a separate meat replacement category. Really interesting things happening in that space, and in and around functional foods and how we're actually providing nutrition and nutrient density to consumers is probably top of mind at the moment. We've bred since the Green Revolution, and the uptake of fertilizers and the ability to grow crops with genetics that are much more productive and crop protection chemistry than they ever have been. We're solving for empty carbohydrates so we haven't bred crops that are nutrient dense, and that is a problem. And I think that we're waking up to that right now, that we need to think more about the types of crops that we're growing, and can we switch our focus to improve, for instance, the applications for aged care and for hospitals, for improving outcomes for patients or for clients. I think you'll see those future trends in hyperlocal food production systems and co-location for those facilities. I think that's where there is an application for CEA, for high value outcome driven functional foods, where I think there will be definitely a marketplace.
Yeah, calorie density for developing country and some specific areas in those countries. And that's tricky because here in Mexico, 60% of the population is overweight, if not obese.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a country in development, and I would say some kind of filler. I think it's with you that I was talking about that with Labradors the other day. If we could do that with humans, right, and fill their bellies and signal their ghrelin that, oh, you're full. I think that would be cool. Just one last question before we finish it off. Are people like justified in feeling like the ethical with the ethical dilemma with Monsanto, for example? Like Monsanto, yes, like you said, they're economically forward companies, so they're capitalists, right? Might have gone on that side a bit too much, but I still think what they do was good for humanity. In the end, they were painted as really evil company. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, that was all off the back of which I sort of, I was part of that whole from the early days, selecting chemistry that worked together with genetic modification, and doing some early trial work back in Australia, back in the 90s. At that stage, Bayer had their own product, glufosinate, which sounds the same. It's a different chemistry. And Monsanto now being part of Bayer. Monsanto there's no doubt they're an easy target, and part of that was probably their corporate approach, and also their approach to litigation for contracts, because they were trying to protect the seed and the seed assets that they'd spent a lot of money, putting into the market, right? But there's probably, perhaps in hindsight, a different approach that may have helped engage the market, and probably I'm sure it's part of an MBA program, is how to approach, in hindsight, market dynamics and consumer engagement. And we're probably seeing the same thing, the same story play out now, right? With cellular agriculture. You can technically do it, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. So there still needs to be a consumer engagement about why is it that we're doing it, why is it we're pursuing this, before you even launch that product into the market. So I think I tend to be more of a mainstream guy. I think on the fringes you'll have on both sides. I've worked with plant protein companies and startups. We do a lot of work with startups in our business.
Right.
They can be in their own echo chamber, just like on the corporate side, you can be in your own echo chamber. And
Right.
what's most important is, how do you mainstream that? How do you find ways to get market acceptance for a solution that's not going to cause damage to the environment? I think the difference is now, as we go forward with carbon accounting and emissions targets and mandatory reporting, is really calling out those companies who perhaps could hide behind a thinly veiled greenwashing of annual reports that say we're doing the right thing and we're socially, all our ESG credentials, but actually when they have to start to report that, or they can't use offsets to account against that. And I think there will be in the future, there'll be more of a focus on insets. How do you actually reduce your carbon load through internal processing innovation?
Right.
That's going to be most important. I mean, at the moment, you would have seen the reporting on Vera with junk carbon offsets, and that's caused a lot of discussion in the market. So how, I think the science in and around carbon sequestration, and particularly agricultural systems and agroforestry, which is where you can tend to make some big gains. In the future, I think farmers honestly are going to need those carbon offsets that they produce themselves against their own inputs of fertilizer, chemistry, diesel, etc. And so, I think it's an area that we should probably hasten slowly on, about signing long-term contracts, and even for boards and their fiduciary duty around what assets they have and what have they signed up for, and how do they validate, how do they report on those to the market for those assets they've got on their balance sheet. I think it's important that we have really clear, transparent validation for carbon. And the only other point I'd make on that, we're talking a lot about carbon. No one's talking much about water. And in my mind, water as a tangible asset, as something that's arguably even more important than carbon, or at least as important as carbon. We have a really small, surprisingly small amount of potable water on the planet. And how we actually access and look after that and repurpose. That is a young company called Botanical Water Technologies. Your listeners should look that up. These guys are going to be a game changer, I believe. We're doing some work together with them. They have technology. I mean, it's not hugely groundbreaking technology. It's more about the application of it in terms of processing fruit and vegetable and sugarcane waste and extracting water, and what you do with that water, which has a certain isotopic profile for food and beverages, for environmental flows, for recharging aquifers. And so it's also around this mindset, which is what our focus is now with the Boralis Group, of how do we, in a circular economy, how do we mainstream solutions for enterprise so that's not totally off the chart expensive. We can use existing technology, but we're taking what's previously been regarded as a waste that's thrown out, fed to pigs, just disposed of, burnt, buried, whatever. How do we take that asset and harvest water, harvest organic materials, harvest nutrients from that, and repurpose that back into the food system? And that's
Take
what
good
we're
shit out of it.
focusing on.
That
Yeah,
would be the
man,
slogan.
exactly. It's like there's so much that we can do that we're just throwing out, and
Right.
and that's our focus at the moment.
Rob, thank you so much for coming today. Where can people find out more about you?
They can jump on our website, www.boralisgroup.com. Can see me, jump into LinkedIn and connect with me. Happy to connect. I think my dad always said it's the places you go, the people you meet, and the books you read. So that's my mantra to live by. Always be curious, and I'm happy to connect with people and have conversations, and that makes the world a richer place.
Thank you for that. And I'm Charles Cormier, your host at ceowisdompodcast.com.